Flow and mindfulness in practice is not something that most people who follow traditional types of programmed routines, for example, mostly coming from the context of fitness or whether it's a training program related to exercise. And it's something that you would see more in disciplines in which there is a consistent movement flow happening between a set of patterns. For example, in something like capoeira or martial arts disciplines, where in reality the movement never stops. Of course, movement never stops in any case. However, our awareness of the starting and stopping of movement is not always there. One thing that I really want to promote with anyone who's following types of programs that I've provided is, whilst you do have a set of exercises on a sheet set out in various sets and reps with tempos and all these certain modalities that I always encourage you to stick to quite strictly, within that there is an approach that I encourage you to cultivate, which is this approach with regards to mindfulness and flow. So what does this basically mean? If we take the two ideas separately, mindfulness is quite simply a self-reflective approach whenever you're doing any type of physical activity. This can be even, for example, walking down the street. It could be how you cut a carrot in the kitchen as you're preparing a meal. It could be awareness towards doing a particular exercise that perhaps in the past you might have done completely mindlessly. And what I mean by mindlessly is not the idea that you're not thinking and you're wasting it. I mean essentially that we're not always trying to create a connection between the sensations that we feel and the movement that is actually happening. What is more common is that the movement becomes quite objectified. So if we take something as simple as a common exercise that, if you're following programming from me, that you would have been practicing or are practicing at the moment, something like the dragon squat. So the dragon squat, for example, is quite a simple movement. If you look at the video resource and you perform it, you even see in the resource it's done quite mechanically. It's simply stepping behind, bringing yourself down, sitting on the heel. So very often what I see is people get down into the position, they kind of sit for a moment. One of two things happens. If it's quite easy for the person, the mind kind of wanders and they're just kind of looking around. The second thing that can happen is that if it's quite a lot of stress for the person, then they lose themselves in the physical sensation that they associate with discomfort, pain, fear, all these types of other things which really interfere with your movement experience. So what I would like to encourage with movements such as this, that in their visual form and in their practice are quite simple and quite isolated, is to really reflect on the differences, for example, between side to side, the sensations and the sensitivity of skin brushing against skin, the sensations of blood filling the legs, these different sensations that are always present in the body, but in many cases we often don't take time to reflect on them. If we are too much in a habit of essentially just doing movements and objectively performing things, of course from the outside it might just look exactly the same. Now he's doing a dragon squat, she's doing a dragon squat. However, what we want to focus on most of all is the subjective experience, your experience. Not the objective experience of, okay, the form, it looks like a dragon squat, but the subjective experience of, how is this different from yesterday? How is it different from 5 seconds before? What sensations do I feel in my body? What emotions do I feel? What even ideas do I have that come into my mind as I'm performing this movement? This doesn't mean that you have to be so reflective that you're holding a journal in your hand as you're doing your dragon squat and writing down all your sensations. However, it brings us to the next point, from mindfulness to flow. Now, flow is a term that's thrown around quite a lot because it is very difficult to pin down. Flow, quite simply, I would describe as a seamless transition, not only physically, but psychologically, emotionally, from one movement to another. Now, If you're following a programmed structure, it's very often the case, especially in the early stages, that you're following quite isolated patterns. So you might think in your mind, well, how can I flow from one movement to another because I'm just practicing one movement? I would say to you, you should take this isolated opportunity to realize that transitions are always taking place, that movement is always taking place throughout your practice, whether that's between a concentric, an isometric, and an eccentric movement, or whether that's the case that you're transitioning from one gross pattern, such as a locomotion pattern, into another type of locomotion pattern. So let's take this example back to the dragon squat. So what I'll see very often, and again, it is displayed this way in the video resources, but what I like to encourage as you come down into the dragon squat, even now, I'm standing to prepare myself for my dragon squat, and I'm feeling where the weight is in my feet. I feel the weight in my big toe. I feel perhaps that maybe I'm slightly falling back or forward. I take note of all these different sensations. The first point of the dragon squat, I start to shift my body weight to one side, and now I have the sensation that this leg is heavier and this leg is becoming lighter. As it becomes lighter, I then am tracing onto the big toe of my foot as I draw this across the ground. I draw it behind me in a constant arc until it finds the place where it needs to be, and then I come straight into the movement. I can feel the skin of the front of my leg here brushing against the back as it's sinking deeper. I adjust slightly my backside on the heel, and I feel this movement. And now what I'm feeling right now is that I could actually, the next time I do this, bring it a little bit closer because I'm actually a bit wide, and I think I want to explore this sensation of being a little bit tighter. So this is something I'll put in my mind and I'll save for the next time I practice this movement. So likewise now, when I come out of the dragon squat, I'm coming straight back up. I slide to the side, and I immediately slide back in to the other side as it comes round, and I sit myself into the position. So I sit for the time that's prescribed for myself, and I use this time, I don't think of it as I have to spend 30 seconds in this position. I think of it as I'm visiting this place for 30 seconds only. For 30 seconds only. So you jump off the plane, you get into a new city, you've got 30 seconds to explore the place. Another example of this is a friend of mine who had a stopover in Beijing for 12 hours. And you can actually see a lot of crazy stuff in Beijing in 12 hours. You can see the Great Wall, you can see certain monuments, you can see very historical places. If you invest everything in that time and you're well aware that in that limited amount of time, you need to take the most experience that you can. This is how I approach a movement like this as well. So I've spent my time in here. When I come back to the other side, now I'm actually leaning a bit more forward as I come into my dragon squat. I'm tracing the floor a little bit differently, and now this is a little bit tighter. This is quite nice. I like this position here. I may even shift my weight slightly back and forward. Just feeling these micro changes. I bring myself up, I make sure I'm twisting it here. I might even give a moment just to untwist and just to sense the movement. Now what is happening here? The in-between the movement is one of the most important things we can study if we're trying to develop a greater understanding of what movement really means when it's embodied. Very often, many of us are coming from backgrounds which take a perspective on physical practice of exercise. Exercise is a tool. Exercise necessarily means repetition of a certain type of movement until it's improved. But even in some cases, this is not true. In many cases, exercise is just performed for the sake of doing it with a type of abstract goal in mind, such as, at the end of it, whenever that might be, it makes me fitter, or other things like this. what we want to do is actually really build an experience not only with the movement, but with movement as a concept in general. And starting with something just as simple as the transitions between movements. And this doesn't only mean the transition within a particular set of movements, for example, dragon squat one side to dragon squat the other side. For me, this is also while you're waiting and walking around between your sets, as you exit a movement, as you enter a movement. For example, something as simple as a push-up. As you're entering to the push-up, perhaps you're kneeling on the floor, you can feel the weight in your toes. You're going to shift the weight forward. As you come forward, you're planting the hands. I'm checking in my mind, I'm feeling the position of these hands, and I have some references for this position of the hands. I want the hands to be similar to the way that I hold the hand as I do a handstand. With this is transferable knowledge. So I think, okay, would I want to put my weight on these hands? This feels nice. I breathe. I step my way into the position, a small stretch. I lock myself in. Then I take the checkpoints. The scap is locked in. I'm tight. I squeeze the glutes. I breathe in. And for example, if I have an isometric hold in the bottom, I sense it. Yeah, it's okay. So this starts to bring us to the concept of difficulty with movement. One of the main reactions when we find difficulty in the movement is very often to block the movement. And this is one of the key ideas with regards to flow that you want to practice and try to comprehend if you are to develop this feeling of the ambiguous flow. And this idea is not blocking yourself. Blockages with regards to movement are present on the micro scale, by which I mean through exercise and specific movements, and in the macro scale, by which I mean the way that you conduct yourself in your life. We are very aware that certain experiences we have can cause emotional impacts, can cause psychological impacts that develop blockages in our systems. And as Feldenkrais said, back in 1945, and we were talking very, very long time ago, he already said that it's impossible to think of an emotional or a psychological experience that does not have a connecting physiological experience, and vice versa. So when we get, for example, some kind of emotional blockages, whether someone said something to us or we said something to someone else and we feel bad about it, whether it's the weather, whether it's the air in the room, whether you just didn't get a great sleep last night, this will most definitely affect the way that you move. However, it also means that through your movement, you can help alleviate some of these types of blockages if you can recognize where they're happening. Likewise, on the other side of the coin, if you are blocking yourself when you're performing movement in your practice, this can in other ways translate into certain types of blockages in your emotional and your physiological and psychological state. Now, I'm not talking about if you're holding your breath or having a very unflowy practice in your physical practice that it's going to cause you psychological problems. This is not the point, it's just an extrapolation. However, what I mean is that very often I will see people performing certain movements, and the strain in the face alone shows you that there is a blockage of energy that's being transmitted through the body and held in one place, rather than letting this energy flow back into the body and continue in a continuous circle and feeding back into the movement, back into your emotion, back into your psychology. So there's a continuous movement of this energy happening through your body, rather than it coming to one place and it gets blocked And one of the effects is this. See what happens. So, for example, even if you're performing something that's quite strenuous, such as a planche hold, there's many ways you can take your planche holds. You can go for the planche hold where you're giving it your max, and you give it beans, and you're holding it, and you look, and it's and this happens at the end. Well, in all honesty, it's completely unnecessary. This dead ending to the movement activity, it's on, it's off. And if there's anything that, for example, the concept of yin and yang and these perspectives of balancing energy in the body is that 500% yin and 500% yang is not balance. It's not like 5 days a week I eat perfectly and towards a particular diet that is good for my body, and then 2 days a week, like I used to do in the past, I go to McDonald's and KFC and eat all these things. Likewise, I sit in an office for 10 hours a day and then I go for a 3-mile run. This is not balance. This is too much yin, too much yang. So what we're looking for is a texture of the movement that, yes, it has ebbs and it has flows, but it's continuous. It's not a sudden burst and bang, it's gone. This means that the points in my practice that I consider, rest periods, these would be better called reflection periods. So I visit an experience, and my experience now is in the form of tuck planche, and I'm going to experience this by entering into the movement, the texture of the floor. Perhaps you're working on a different type of floor. I'm feeling the floor. I feel my hands. I think about my checkpoints, my breath. I lock in the scapula. I come into the position. I feel the weight. I lock in my checkpoints. I grip the floor. Slowly, 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 I feel, okay. Now it's difficult, but I try to maintain a good demeanor. And before I break, I bring myself down. I absorb it, I breathe, I stretch the wrists, a little shake, I go in for my next hold, I prepare, I lock it in, I try to keep my face relaxed, and then I bring myself down. Now, of course, you may think, well, you're well practiced in this movement, so of course you can keep a straight face. Well, the reality is that whatever progression you're doing should be your progression. If I'm working something like this, I will always work to the maximal I can for my progression on this particular movement, which means your maximal progression for your movement is going to be no different to mine in terms of the effort that's involved, which then means there is no difference in whether you're able to maintain this concept of reflection in your practice and also the idea of flow. This is something that I always want you to take into account with every single movement that you do, which means that this in itself is a huge project that every single movement you visit, to take a step back as you're performing the movement and think to yourself, am I simply just doing this movement because it's on the piece of paper and I have to do it? Or am I performing this movement because I am looking to experience it and perhaps learn something from it? And this should be the ultimate goal for your movement practice. I say ultimate, but one of the overarching goals is to learn from your practice. To learn from your practice. And the learning of your practice is something that's embodied, as well as something that is going to affect you psychologically, emotionally, and all these other things, ultimately bringing us to an acceptance of the realization that there is no separation between these two. As I already mentioned, if you find a movement very, very difficult, and you're straining for whatever reason it is, it will appear in your physiological state. If, for some reason you have perhaps a negative relationship with a movement, perhaps in the past you had an injury with this movement, or perhaps it's very much out of what you're normally comfortable with. For example, if you're from a practice that's normally quite soft, and I have you practicing something like weightlifting, you may approach the movement and your first response to putting that weight in your back is, "Ugh." This is a completely psychological response. It will affect you physiologically. So it's very often that we speak about psychosomatic symptoms. This is something that we're well aware of. That if I think, oh, I'm very sick, or I get very paranoid, it will affect not only the way that I feel in my body, but also the way that I physically act and move around people. There's also the perspective of somatic psycho. So this essentially means that the way that I act through my body directly affects my psychology, directly affects my emotion, and directly affects my general experience with regards to movement. In extending from this idea of finding meaningfulness, reflecting, and also flow in your movement, what we ultimately want to achieve is a complete detachment from any psychological or even physiological preconceptions we have about a movement. So what does that mean? It basically means that this idea that, oh, I really like this movement. And for example, if you're submitting me videos, I can see that you like this movement. I can see that you enjoy it. And enjoyment is not something that we strive for in our movement practice. This is something else that I'll speak about another time. But of course, there will be things that we enjoy, there will be things that we are indifferent to, and there will be things that we specifically do not enjoy doing. And one of the most productive things, first of all, we can do, because if you have a bad relationship with a movement, it's not going to be the case that just by thinking about it for 5 minutes, oh no, actually it's fine. It doesn't work like this. This is why it's practice. What I encourage you to do is start a process over time to try, when you approach this movement, to not have a positive or a negative relationship with it, or a negative or positive relationship perception of that movement. And this is essentially what will help alleviate those types of blockages that come with things like negative or positive relationships. It comes with insecurity. If you're not quite sure what you're doing, this is very possible as well. And by doing this, you will see this practice start to filter throughout your entire movement practice. So I'll just take one or two more examples. One example I'll take, still relating to the dragon squat, is going to be when we start to locomote through space. So one thing that can often happen if we're doing a traveling dragon squat or a dragon walk is I step behind, I drop, I turn, I stand up, I step, I drop, I turn, I stand up, I step, I drop, I turn, I step. Yeah? And this is, by all means, from an objective point of view, you're fulfilling the movement. You're standing up, you're stepping behind, you're dropping down, you're sitting on the heel, you're turning. But this is not reality. This is not, even within this seeming start-stop of affairs, it represents what is happening in your mind. And I can see this, which is why I encourage you very many times in the types of feedback that I give to try and eradicate these type of stop-start moments that represent things such as being unsure, such as insecurity, such as negative relationships towards movements. And what it develops into is something that when you look at it, you think, ah, yeah, that's how I want to move. And what you see is flow. Something as simple as the dragon walk. As I start here, again, I'm gripping my toes against the floor because I like to feel the type of surface I'm working on. At the moment, this is quite grippy, so it would change perhaps the way that I slide my foot along the floor. And here it's soft, so I'll probably change the texture of my movement at that point too. Feel the weight, I shift the weight, My arms are here to counterbalance. I tip straight through. My weight is shifting again. I'm sliding. I made a bit more space this time. The arms are really doing what they want to do. I could give you instructions for the arms and how they work, but again, this would just be something else that would block you. The same thing with movements such as the gallop. As I'm working through and I come back. It never stopped. It never stopped. I come in, I drop down. It never stopped. It never stopped. And guess what? It never stops. Now I'm talking to you. And I'm coming down to the floor. I'm stretching my hand against the floor. I'm leaning forward. I'm breathing. I come to bring myself closer towards the camera. I step forward. I bring myself through. And I bring myself into a conversational pose. This is all I wanted to share with you with these two perspectives, with the ultimate perspective of helping develop flow inside your general practice. And what it is, in a nutshell, is it's a step away from the objectification of movement that we often see in the spheres, for example, such as fitness, and in all honesty, in general performance training. Because when you're doing performance type of training, for example, if you're an athlete and you want to develop better at something, you know, you're not concerned so much about the quality and the experience of the movement that you're doing. You're worried about the quality and your performance when you step out into your field. And this is why we are not performance developing practitioners. We are movement practitioners. And if this is also something that you share or you would like to start developing in yourself and in your practice, it must begin with the simplest experiences. You can see now, just as I sit here, I'm just feeling the texture of my skin against my hand. And you might think, oh, now he's just talking about every single thing that he's doing, but there's an awareness of it. There's an awareness of it. And this is also why when I say to people that, I practice a minimum of 4 to 6 hours a day, and they might think, what's this? Well, I mean, first of all, this is not just strength and mobility practice. Don't get me wrong. My strength and mobility practice is much less than this. And actually, when I'm actually out practicing doing things, this is probably only around 2 to 4 hours a day. The rest of that time, for example, when I'm sitting around on my laptop, I'm constantly moving. I'm feeling the sensations in my body. I reflect when something starts to build up in tension. I have a little stretch. I reflect on how my hands are sitting on my knees and all these different things, just to develop a habit and an understanding and relationship with movement in general. And of course, we're dealing with movement now on the physiological perspective, but as I already said, this is inextricably tied with all the other facets of your being, whether that's spiritual, emotional, psychological. It is inseparable. So the first thing we can do to bring ourselves away from this historical perspective of a separation between things such as body and mind and even spirit is to start to take notice and build awareness of all the smaller things that are happening around us that we may not even be aware of because we're not taking the time to think about it. And why not? What better place to start than within your physical practice that's set down on a piece of paper? How can you bring that physical practice to life so that you don't just find yourself repping, and by the end of it looking that you have another set and going, oh, I have another set. So no, you have more experience to be experienced. This perspective can help with many things. For example, people's reservations when the fatigue starts to kick in, when perhaps you've gone a bit too hard one week, when perhaps your sleep hasn't been so good and the work is piling up and the family things are piling up, and then you've also got to do your physical practice, and then you feel like you have this responsibility that you have to fulfill. There is no responsibility you have to fulfill. The only responsibility you have, as always, is to yourself. You always have the responsibility to yourself. And the responsibility I would like to share with you is simply that of appreciating, really experiencing, reflecting on all aspects of your movement, starting with your programming, and then seeing over time how this awareness contributes to you essentially as a mover, whether that's in your physical practice, in your daily practice, your social practices, and whatever types of practices that you do. That's all I would like to share for you today. Keep practicing well.